Merritt Prescott stood at the altar, seconds away from marrying a sadistic tyrant to save her brother. She had a scalpel hidden in her garter, ready to end it all before the honeymoon. But just as the vows began, the ceremonial doors didn't just open, they disintegrated. King Roark, the ruthless alpha of all wolves, stormed in hunting an assassin. He wasn't there for a wedding, he was there for an execution. Until he caught a scent he recognized, the scent of the stranger who saved his life in the woods. He didn't object. He didn't ask. He marched up the aisle, ripped the bride from the tight grips of the arrogant Beta, and claims her with a primal bite. The contract was void. The war had just begun. Chapter 1. The Price of a Life. The halogen bulb above the examination table flickered with a persistent, buzzing rhythm that would have driven a lesser medic to distraction, but Merritt Prescott barely heard it. Her focus was entirely on the jagged laceration tearing across the young miner's forearm. He hissed through his teeth as she poured a generic saline solution over the wound, the clear liquid washing away the grime of the coal pits to reveal the raw, red flesh beneath. Merritt didn't offer empty platitudes about the pain. She knew it hurt, and she knew he needed her to be efficient rather than sympathetic. She threaded the curved needle with a steady hand, her movements practiced and precise, born of necessity in a territory where real doctors were a luxury the working class couldn't afford. Ashen Vale wasn't just poor, it was forgotten, a gray smudge on the map of the werewolf kingdom where hope went to die of exhaustion. "You're lucky, Jace," Merritt said, her voice calm as she pierced the tough skin to begin the suture. Another inch to the left, and the rock shard would have severed the radial artery. You'd have bled out before the foreman even got you to the surface. The boy, barely 18 and already sporting the hollow eyes of a veteran laborer, gritted his teeth and looked away from the needle. "Doesn't feel lucky, Merritt. Feels like I'm going to lose a week's pay while this heals. My old man is going to kill me." "He won't kill you. He needs your paycheck too much," Merritt replied, tying off the first stitch and moving to the next. She wasn't being cruel, just honest. Survival in Ashen Vale was a math equation, and variables like rest and recovery were rarely factored in. "I'm using the last of the bioglue to seal this after the stitches. It should cut the healing time in half, provided you don't shift. If you shift, you'll rip it open, and I'll have to charge you double to fix it. Do you understand?" Jace nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. Merritt finished the work quickly, bandaging the arm with efficient tight wraps. She wiped her hands on a rag, the smell of iron and rubbing alcohol clinging to her skin. It was the perfume of her life, sterile, sharp, and unrelenting. She sent Jace on his way with a packet of herbal painkillers she had ground herself, watching him disappear into the slate-gray twilight. She was tired, her bones aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. But there was no time to rest. Her brother, Leo, would be home from school soon, and if she didn't get back to the house, he would try to cook dinner and likely set the kitchen on fire again. The walk home was a study in desolation. The houses in her sector were peeling and tired, their porches sagging like the shoulders of the wolves who lived inside them. But as Merritt turned the corner onto her street, the rhythm of her footsteps faltered. Parked in front of her family's modest weathering home was a vehicle that didn't belong. It was a sleek, armored SUV, its black paint gleaming with an arrogance that seemed to mock the potholed road beneath its tires. The windows were tinted darker than midnight, and the insignia on the grille wasn't from Ashen Vale. It was the crest of the neighboring territory, a stylized hawk clutching a serpent. Beta Fallon. A cold knot of dread tightened in Merritt's stomach. Beta Fallon was a name whispered in fear, a man known for predatory loans and a sadistic streak that he barely bothered to hide behind his political title. He was a tyrant who collected people like chess pieces. Merritt quickened her pace, her instincts screaming that a predator was in her den. She took the front steps 2 at a time and threw open the door, the hinges protesting with a rusty screech. The living room was suffocatingly warm. Her mother, Lydia, was perched on the edge of the worn sofa, her hands fluttering nervously in her lap like trapped birds. Her father, Magnus, stood by the unlit fireplace, his face the color of old ash, his shoulders hunched in a posture of utter defeat. And sitting in Magnus's favorite armchair, looking entirely too comfortable, was Beta Fallon. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with russet-colored hair that was graying at the temples. He held a crystal tumbler of Magnus's best whiskey, swirling the amber liquid with a look of bored disdain. "Ah, the daughter returns," Fallon said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't stand. He simply turned his gaze toward her, his eyes dark and assessing, stripping her down to her genetic value in a single glance. "Merritt, your father was just telling me about your little hobby, stitching up minors for spare change." Merritt didn't look at her parents. She kept her eyes locked on the intruder, her chin lifted. "It's not a hobby. It's a service. What are you doing here, Fallon? We paid the interest on the loan last week. I saw the receipt." Magnus made a choked sound in his throat, stepping forward with a trembling hand raised. "Merritt, please, watch your tone. The Beta is a guest." "I'm not a guest, Magnus. I'm an investor," Fallon corrected, taking a slow sip of the whiskey before setting the glass down on the stained coffee table. The sound of the glass hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "And I'm afraid your daughter is misinformed. You paid the interest on the first loan. You haven't touched the principal on the second, third, or fourth consolidation. The compound interest has triggered a default clause." Merritt felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to her father, her voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "Dad? What is he talking about? You told me we were stable. You said the gambling stopped." Magnus couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, a broken man. "I thought I could win it back, Merritt. One big payout and we would have been free. I just needed a little more time." 50 million credits, Fallon said, dropping the number into the room like a bomb. "That is the current outstanding balance. Your father bet against the house, little wolf. And the house always wins. By law, I can seize all assets to cover the debt. The house, the land, your meager savings." He paused, a cruel smile stretching his lips. "But we both know this pile of rotting wood isn't worth a fraction of what is owed." Merritt's hands curled into fists at her sides. She was a fighter, but you couldn't fight math. 50 million was an impossible number. It was a life sentence. "So that's it? You're evicting us?" "No," Fallon said softly, standing up. He towered over the room, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the space. He walked toward her, and Merritt forced herself to hold her ground, even as her wolf bristled with revulsion. "I have no use for a homeless family. I have a different proposal. A settlement. I am looking for a wife, Merritt. My bloodline needs vitality. My previous attempts to breed an heir have been disappointing. You, however, have impeccable genetics. Strong, resilient, intelligent. A rare combination in a place like this." Merritt felt bile rise in her throat. He was talking about her like she was a prize mare at an auction. "I'm not for sale." "Everything is for sale," Fallon countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It's just a matter of currency. You see, if you refuse, I won't just take the house. I will invoke the Conscription Act. Your brother Leo, he turns 18 next month, doesn't he?" The mention of Leo shattered Merritt's composure. "Don't you dare." "The border wars are messy right now," Fallon continued, examining his fingernails as if discussing the weather. "New insurgents, chemical weapons. The survival rate for new infantry is discouragingly low, maybe 20%. If I call in the debt, your father goes to debtor's prison, and Leo gets a rifle and a one-way ticket to the front lines. He'll be dead within a week." Lydia sobbed aloud, burying her face in her hands. Magnus looked like he was going to vomit. Merritt felt the world tilting on its axis. Leo was the only bright thing in her life. He was soft-hearted, brilliant, and utterly unsuited for war. He wouldn't last a day. Fallon wasn't just threatening her, he was holding a gun to her brother's head. Merritt took a breath, forcing the panic down, locking it away in a steel box in her mind. She looked at her parents. Useless, broken, compromised. It was up to her. It had always been up to her. She looked back at Fallon, her expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. "If I agree," Merritt said, her voice devoid of emotion, "the debt is wiped clean, entirely. And Leo doesn't go to the front. He goes to the university in the capital. You pay his tuition, and he is exempt from any draft in your territory." Fallon's eyes glinted with triumph, but also a flicker of surprise at her negotiation. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, smelling of expensive cologne and rot. "You drive a hard bargain for someone with no leverage, but I accept. He goes to school. You come to my bed. A fair trade." "I want it in writing," Merritt snapped. "A binding contract, signed tonight, or there is no wedding." "Very well," Fallon said, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a folded document. He had come prepared. He knew she would say yes. He laid it on the table next to the whiskey. "Sign it, and your brother lives the life of a scholar. Refuse, and he dies in the mud." Merritt walked to the table. She picked up the pen, her hand hesitating for only a fraction of a second. She thought of Leo's laugh, of his dreams of becoming an architect. She pressed the pen to the paper and scrawled her name, signing away her freedom, her body, and her future in black ink. Fallon picked up the paper, blowing on the wet ink with a satisfied smirk. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. He looked back at her, his gaze raking over her body with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. 2 weeks, Merritt," Fallon said, his voice low and heavy with a dark promise. "Prepare yourself. Once that ring is on your finger, you belong to me completely. Do not think about running. I will find you, and I will make you watch as I dismantle everything you tried to save." He stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Merritt standing in the silence of her souled life, the sound of her mother's weeping the only eulogy for her freedom. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Woods. The walls of the Prescott home felt like they were closing in, shrinking with every hour that ticked closer to the deadline. Merritt could hear her mother in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing dishes as if she could wash away the debt with soap and hot water, while her father sat in the study, staring blankly at a muted television screen. The air in the house was stale, recycled through lungs heavy with regret and fear, and Merritt knew that if she stayed inside for another minute, she would scream. She grabbed her worn canvas pack, checking the contents, a basic first aid kit, a skinning knife, and a coil of rope, before slipping out the back door. She needed to breathe. She needed to remember that she was still a predator, even if she had just signed herself away as prey. She headed for the tree line that marked the boundary of the Forbidden Woods. It was neutral territory, a sprawling expanse of dense forest that separated Ashen Vale from the wealthier districts. Most wolves avoided it, fearing the rogue packs and the untamed wildlife, but for Merritt, it was a sanctuary. Here, status didn't matter. Debt didn't matter. The only law in the woods was survival of the fittest, and Merritt was very fit. She moved through the underbrush with a silent, fluid grace, her boots finding purchase on the mossy roots without snapping a twig. She wasn't shifting today. She needed the tactile grounding of her human form, the burn of exertion in her legs as she climbed the ridge. She had been tracking a large buck for the better part of an hour, intending to bring fresh meat home for Leo's farewell dinner, when the scent hit her. It wasn't the musk of a deer or the damp rot of the forest floor. It was something metallic, sharp, and acrid. It smelled like a chemical fire doused in copper. Merritt froze, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. The wind shifted, carrying the scent again, stronger this time, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic drag of something massive pulling itself through the fern beds. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It was an investigation. She abandoned the deer trail, following the disturbance in the leaves. The vegetation here was crushed, flattened by a weight that suggested a bear or a massive boar, but the blood spatter on the leaves told a different story. The blood was too dark, almost black in the failing light, and it didn't smell like iron. It smelled like bitter almonds and synthesized death. Merritt crouched low, creeping forward until she reached a small clearing beneath a canopy of ancient oaks. There, collapsed against the gnarled roots of a tree, was the largest wolf she had ever seen. He was a monster of a creature, his fur the color of midnight, absorbing the shadows around him. He was easily twice the size of an average alpha, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps that rattled in his throat. But he wasn't moving. His limbs were splayed at unnatural angles, twitching with microscopic tremors that signaled a catastrophic failure of the nervous system. Merritt approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the wolf didn't react. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He couldn't. Merritt knelt beside the massive head, her medical training overriding her fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing the coarse fur near his neck, and pulled back his eyelid. The pupil was blown wide, swallowing the iris, but she caught a flash of amber fire. He was conscious. He was locked inside a dying body, fully aware of his helplessness. She pressed her hand to his flank, feeling the erratic, thudding beat of his heart. It was fighting a losing battle against a toxin she recognized with a jolt of horror. The paralysis, the tremors, the almond scent. It was nightshade. Not the plant, but the weaponized synthetic derivative that was rumored to be used by Black Ops assassination squads. "You're in trouble, big guy," Merritt whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. She looked around the clearing, scanning for pursuers. Whoever had done this hadn't finished the job, which meant they were likely still tracking him. "If you stay here, you're dead. If I leave you, you're dead. And you are far too heavy for me to carry." The wolf let out a low, pained whine, a sound that vibrated through Merritt's hand. It wasn't a plea for mercy, it was a sound of frustration. He wanted to fight, but his biology had betrayed him. Merritt looked at his flank again and saw the entry wound, a small, clean puncture from a dart or a high-velocity injection round. The area around it was necrotic, the tissue turning gray as the poison leached into his bloodstream. "I can't move you," Merritt said, opening her pack and laying out her supplies on the damp earth. "So we're going to have to do this here. I don't have the specific antidote for military-grade nightshade, but I can synthesize a chelating agent to bind the toxin and buy you time. It's going to hurt. A lot. But the alternative is your heart stopping in about 20 minutes. She looked into the wolf's unblinking eye. There was intelligence there, a terrifying depth of awareness. He held her gaze, and for a second, the forest went silent. Merritt felt a strange pull in her chest, a magnetic snap that she chalked up to the intensity of the moment. She uncapped a vial of rubbing alcohol and pulled out her scalpel. "Don't bite me," she muttered, positioning the blade over the wound. "I'm the only thing standing between you and the Reaper." Chapter 3. The Midnight Patient. The forest had plunged into true darkness, the canopy blocking out the stars, leaving Merritt to work by the narrow beam of her tactical flashlight clamped between her teeth. The surgery was brutal and messy. She had to cut away the necrotic tissue around the injection site to stop the continuous leaching of the poison, her hands slick with the wolf's blood as she worked. He hadn't made a sound when she sliced into him, a testament to either his discipline or the overwhelming paralysis, but she could feel the heat radiating off his body, a fever spiking as his immune system went to war. Merritt worked with a focus that blurred the edges of the world. She ground up charcoal tablets and mixed them with a saline solution and a potent astringent herb she had gathered earlier, creating a thick black paste. It was primitive, battlefield medicine, but it was all she had. She packed the wound with the mixture, hoping the charcoal would absorb the residual toxin before it hit his major organs. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice muffled by the flashlight. She checked his vitals again. His heart rate was still erratic, but the tremors had subsided slightly. "I need you to metabolize this. You have to push it out. If you give up now, I went through all this trouble for nothing." She pulled a syringe from her kit, filled with a generic stimulant she kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it might jumpstart his system. She found a vein in his foreleg, tapping the massive limb to bring the vessel to the surface, and injected the fluid. The wolf's body seized, a violent convulsion that nearly knocked Merritt backward. She threw her weight across his shoulders, holding him down as he thrashed against the paralysis. "Easy," she hissed, smoothing his fur with long, firm strokes. "It's just the adrenaline. Let it work." Slowly, the thrashing ceased, replaced by deep, shuddering breaths. The wolf turned his head, movement finally, and looked at her. In the harsh LED light, his eyes were pools of molten gold, burning with a mixture of agony and curiosity. He lifted his head inches off the ground and nudged her hand with his wet nose. The contact sent a shockwave through Merritt's arm that had nothing to do with static electricity. It was a biological recognition, a deep, resonant hum in her marrow that made her breath hitch. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, whining in confusion. "Mate?" Merritt shoved the thought down violently. She was exhausted, stressed, and engaged to a tyrant. She was hallucinating. She pulled her hand away, wiping the blood on her pants. "Don't get sentimental. I'm just doing my job." She sat back against the tree trunk, exhausted. She couldn't leave him. If the assassins came back, he was a sitting duck. She cleaned her scalpel and sheathed it, then pulled the heavy skinning knife from her belt. She settled in for the long haul, her back pressed against the wolf's massive flank for warmth. It was a dangerous intimacy, sleeping with an alpha she didn't know, but out here, he was the safest thing around. Hours passed in the silence of the woods. The wolf's breathing evened out, becoming a rhythmic lullaby that fought against Merritt's vigilance. At one point, he shifted, curling his massive body around her in a protective semicircle, effectively shielding her from the wind. His heat was immense, a furnace against the chill of the night. Merritt found her hand resting on his fur again, her fingers buried in the thick, coarse coat. He felt solid, unbreakable. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of her family's debt felt distant. Here, in the dark, she wasn't a commodity to be sold. She was just a girl keeping death at bay. "You better be worth it," she whispered into the darkness, her eyelids heavy. "Whoever you are, you better survive this." The wolf didn't answer, but she felt a low rumble in his chest, a vibration that felt suspiciously like a purr. Merritt let her head drop back against the tree, the knife loose in her grip, and allowed herself to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, guarded by the monster she had saved. Chapter 4. The Ghost in the Morning. Merritt woke with a gasp, her body jerking into wakefulness as the morning sun pierced through the leaves, blinding her. She reached for the knife, slashing at the empty air before her brain caught up with her reflexes. She froze, blinking against the light. She was alone. The clearing was empty. The massive black wolf was gone. Merritt scrambled to her feet, her joints stiff from the cold ground. She spun in a circle, scanning the tree line. "Hello? Big guy?" Silence answered her, save for the mocking call of a crow. She looked down at the ground where he had lain. The earth was churned up, the moss torn by claws that had found purchase again. A pile of bloody, charcoal-soaked bandages lay in a neat pile near the roots of the oak tree. He hadn't been dragged away. He had walked. He had recovered enough to stand, to move, and to leave her without a backward glance. A sharp pang of disappointment pierced her chest, sharper than she expected. She felt foolish. She had risked her life, used her precious supplies, and slept curled up against a stranger. And he hadn't even waited to verify she was safe before vanishing. It was a stark reminder of how the world worked. The strong took what they needed and left the weak behind. The connection she had felt, the hum in her blood, was just a delusion born of stress and proximity. "Fine," Merritt muttered, kicking dirt over the bloody bandages to hide the evidence. "Be that way. You're welcome." She gathered her pack, checking the contents. He hadn't touched anything. Her knife, her remaining supplies, it was all there. She shouldered the bag and began the long trek back to Ashen Vale, her mood darkening with every step. The freedom of the woods evaporated as the chimney smoke of the settlement came into view. The reality of her life was waiting for her like a physical blow. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks left. The time passed in a blur of misery. Merritt moved through the days like a ghost in her own life. She worked double shifts at the clinic, hoarding credits she would never get to spend, giving them to Leo for his travel fund. She avoided her father, whose shame made him unable to look her in the eye, and she tolerated her mother's frantic energy. Lydia Prescott had turned the wedding into a distraction, obsessing over flower arrangements and table settings, as if a nice centerpiece could disguise the fact that she was selling her daughter to a monster. On the night before the wedding, the house was quiet. Leo had already packed his bags. He was leaving for the capital immediately after the ceremony. Merritt sat in her room, staring at the dress hanging on the back of her door. It was a vintage lace gown her mother had found, smelling faintly of lavender and desperation. It looked like a shroud. Merritt stood up and went to her dresser. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a surgical steel scalpel, razor-sharp and sterile. She didn't plan to use it on Fallon. She knew she couldn't kill a beta in single combat, and the retaliation against Leo would be severe. No, the scalpel was for her. It was her exit strategy. If Fallon tried to break her mind, if he tried to turn her into a hollow shell, she would bleed out on his expensive sheets before she let him take her soul. She lifted the hem of the wedding dress and found the thick band of the lace garter. She carefully slipped the scalpel into the hidden pocket she had sewn into the fabric. It sat against her thigh, cold and reassuring. "Merritt?" She jumped, turning to see Leo standing in the doorway. He looked young, terrifyingly young, his eyes red-rimmed. Are you really going to do this?" Merritt forced a smile, walking over to hug him. She held him tight, memorizing the smell of his soap, the feel of his bony shoulders. "It's going to be fine, Leo. Fallon is rich. I'll be living in a mansion. You just focus on your grades. Make me proud." "I hate him," Leo whispered into her shoulder. "I hate Dad for doing this." "Don't hate," Merritt said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "Hate makes you sloppy. You just survive. You become the best architect the capital has ever seen, and one day, you come back and buy this whole damn town. Okay?" Leo nodded, tears spilling over. Merritt wiped them away with her thumb. She couldn't afford to cry. She had to be stone. Tomorrow she was walking to her execution, and she intended to do it with her head held high. Chapter 5. The Walk to the Slaughter. The morning of the wedding was gray and oppressive, the sky hanging low over Ashen Vale like a bruised eyelid. The air was thick with humidity, threatening a storm that refused to break. Merritt sat in the back of the rented town car, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the passing decay of her hometown. The lace of her dress was scratchy, digging into her skin, and the corset was laced tight enough to restrict her breathing. But the physical discomfort was a grounding distraction from the panic fluttering in her chest. Beside her, her father was silent. Magnus looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. He wore a tuxedo that had seen better days, smelling of mothballs and stale whiskey. He reached out once to pat her hand, but Merritt pulled away before he could make contact. She couldn't bear his touch right now. If he offered an apology, she might scream. And if she screamed, she wouldn't stop. The car pulled up to the ceremonial hall. It was an ancient structure, the wood weathered to a silver gray, the steps sagging under the weight of years. Fallon hadn't offered to pay for a venue. He wanted the wedding here, in the heart of the poverty he owned, to demonstrate his benevolence to the locals. A crowd had gathered, curious neighbors, debtors, and Fallon's security detail, who looked more like prison guards than wedding ushers. Merritt stepped out of the car, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. The camera flashes from the local press blinded her for a moment. Fallon loved publicity. He wanted everyone to see his new acquisition. She kept her face blank, a porcelain mask of indifference, and took her father's arm. Magnus was trembling. "I'm sorry, Merritt," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never meant for this." "Let's just get it over with," Merritt said coldly, dragging him toward the stairs. Inside, the ceremonial hall smelled of mildew and old wax. The pews were packed. Merritt saw faces she knew, patients she had stitched up, shopkeepers she had bartered with, all looking at her with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't their daughters walking down the aisle. At the altar, Beta Fallon waited. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Merritt's house. His russet hair was slicked back, and his smile was a predator's baring of teeth. As Merritt approached, she saw the triumph in his eyes. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her body, assessing the curves beneath the lace with a proprietary glint that made her stomach churn. Magnus handed her off at the altar like a parcel. Fallon took her hand, his grip crushing. His skin was hot and clammy. He pulled her closer than necessary, leaning down to whisper in her ear, his breath smelling of mint and rot. "You look acceptable," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Smile, Merritt. You're ruining the photos. And remember what we discussed. After today, the clinic is closed. No more playing doctor. Your hands belong to me now." Merritt stiffened, her fingernails digging into her palms. The threat was specific and cruel. He wanted to strip away her identity, to take the one thing that made her feel useful. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with hatred so pure it felt like a physical weapon. "My hands," she whispered back, "know exactly where the carotid artery is, Fallon. Remember that when you sleep." Fallon's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flash of anger, but he smoothed it over as Elder Dorian stepped up to the podium. The microphone screeched, and the ceremony began. Merritt tuned out the words, focusing on the scalpel against her thigh. "Just get through the vows. Just get Leo out." "Do you, Merritt Prescott," Dorian droned. "Come here of your own free will?" The silence stretched. Merritt looked at Leo in the front row. He was crying silently. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and despair. "I do," she lied. The doors behind them rattled, the wood groaning under a sudden, immense pressure. The air in the ceremonial hall shifted, the barometric pressure dropping instantly as if a hurricane had just materialized in the vestibule. Fallon looked up, annoyed. Merritt turned her head, her heart skipping a beat. "And do you, Beta Fallon?" Boom. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they exploded inward, ripped from their hinges by a force that sent splinters flying like shrapnel across the back pews. A collective scream went up from the congregation. Through the swirling dust and debris, a silhouette emerged, massive, dark, and terrifyingly familiar. Merritt's breath hitched. The ghost from the woods hadn't abandoned her. He had come to collect. Chapter 6. The Raid. The organist scrambled backward, tripping over his bench as dust and splinters rained down from the shattered entrance. The collective gasp of the congregation seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room, leaving a vacuum filled only by the heavy, thudding rhythm of combat boots hitting the wooden floor. Through the swirling haze of debris, figures emerged. Clad in matte black tactical armor, their faces obscured by ballistic visors, rifles raised and sweeping the pews with terrifying precision. They moved not like police, but like a Reaper squad, flanking the aisles and securing the perimeter in seconds. In the center of the formation walked a man who needed no armor to command fear. He wore a charcoal military coat that emphasized the sheer breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair cropped close in a severe, utilitarian cut. King Roark. He didn't look like the polished monarch Merritt had seen on the televised council addresses. He looked like war personified. A fresh, angry scar cut through his eyebrow, and his movement carried a slight, predatory limp, but his presence was so overwhelming that the guests closest to the aisle shrank back, terrifyingly silent. Merritt stood frozen at the altar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She recognized the walk. It was the same gait as the wolf in the woods, heavy, deliberate, and undeniably lethal. He wasn't a ghost. He was the king. Beta Fallon recovered from his shock, his face twisting into a snarl of indignation. He stepped in front of Merritt, blocking her from view, though his scent spiked with the acrid tang of fear. "This is a private ceremony, Roark. You have no jurisdiction in this ceremonial hall. We are outside the royal zone." "This isn't a ceremony." Roark's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, bypassing Fallon entirely. "It's a crime scene. Secure the exits. No one leaves until I find the manufacturer." Roark stopped 10 feet from the dais, his amber eyes scanning the room with the cold calculation of a targeting system. He inhaled deeply, testing the air. He wasn't looking for a bride. He was hunting the chemical signature of the toxin that had nearly killed him. Merritt watched his nostrils flare. He was tracking the poison. If he found the residue on her hands, or if he realized she knew the symptoms, she would be implicated. Then he stopped. His head snapped toward the altar, his gaze bypassing the fuming Beta and locking directly onto Merritt. The recognition was violent. It wasn't the soft, romantic realization of fairy tales. It was the sharp, sudden clarity of a predator identifying its savior. He didn't see the lace dress or the bouquet. He smelled the iodine, the crushed willow bark, and the distinct, clean fragrance of rain that clung to her skin. It was the scent that had kept him tethered to the living world while he lay dying in the dirt. Roark took a step forward, his mission parameters evaporating in an instant. The soldiers behind him hesitated, sensing the shift in their commander's focus. "You," Roark breathed, the word barely audible over the terrified whimpering of Merritt's mother in the front row. Fallon, sensing the king's attention on his prize, puffed out his chest, trying to assert dominance. He grabbed Merritt's arm, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. "She is not part of your investigation. She is my wife." The vows were exchanged. "The vows were interrupted," Roark corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper. He moved closer, entering the personal space of the altar, towering over Fallon. "And unless you want your blood to paint this floor, you will remove your hand from her." "She is paid for," Fallon shouted, his composure cracking. "Her father's debt is cleared. By the Property Acts, she is mine to breed and break as I see fit. Even a king cannot steal a lawful purchase." Merritt flinched at the words breed and break. She looked up at Roark, expecting to see indifference. Kings rarely cared about the plight of debt slaves. But what she saw in his golden eyes made her breath hitch. It wasn't indifference. It was a rage so profound it looked like madness. "Purchase," Roark repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Merritt, seeing the terror she was trying so hard to hide behind her stoic mask. He saw the scalpel outline in her pocket, the tension in her jaw. She hadn't been waiting for a rescue. She had been preparing for a war. "I am taking her into custody," Roark announced, his voice booming to the back of the room. "She is a key witness in a treason investigation. Under the right of seizure, she is now under the protection of the crown." Fallon laughed, a desperate, high-pitched sound. "A witness? She's a country doctor. She knows nothing. You just want her because she's rare. You're a thief, Roark." "I am the Alpha," Roark snarled, his control snapping. "And I don't steal, I claim." He moved faster than Merritt could follow. One moment he was standing still, and the next, he had vaulted the low railing. He didn't strike Fallon. He simply shoved him aside with a negligent backhand that sent the Beta crashing into the podium. Wood splintered, and the microphone screeched a dying feedback loop. Roark stood before Merritt, the violence in his eyes softening for a fraction of a second as he looked down at her. "I told you I'd pay my debt," he murmured, his voice rough. "I didn't ask for this," Merritt whispered, trembling. "You saved a wolf," Roark replied, reaching out to touch her cheek. "You got a king." Chapter 7. The Claiming. The shock of Roark's skin against hers was electric. It wasn't just warmth. It was a biological imperative, a current that snapped through Merritt's nervous system and made her knees buckle. He caught her effortlessly, his arm wrapping around her waist like an iron band. The contact triggered a roar of possessiveness from the crowd. Fallon's men were rising from the pews, hands going to their holsters, but Roark's guard raised their rifles, the red laser dots dancing across the chests of the guests. The standoff was precarious, a single twitch away from a massacre. Fallon scrambled up from the debris of the podium, blood trickling from his lip. "You cannot take her without a trial. The council will strip you of your title for this. It is abduction." "It isn't abduction if she belongs to me," Roark said calmly. He turned Merritt so her back was to his chest, shielding her from the room. He swept her heavy hair aside, exposing the curve of her neck and the sensitive mating gland that lay beneath the skin. Merritt gasped, realizing what he intended. The mating mark wasn't just a symbol. It was a biological override. It changed a wolf's pheromones, rewiring their chemical signature to match their mate. It was permanent. It was absolute. "Roark, wait," Merritt stammered, her hands clutching at his coat. "You don't have to." "It's the only way to void the contract," Roark whispered against her ear, his breath hot. "If I mark you, his claim is legally and physically null. He can't touch you without getting sick. Trust me." He didn't wait for her consent. He couldn't afford to. He leaned down and sank his teeth into the junction of her shoulder and neck. Pain flared, sharp and stinging, but it was immediately swallowed by a rush of endorphins so potent the world went white. Merritt cried out, her head falling back against his shoulder. It felt like liquid gold was being poured into her veins, burning away the fear and the cold. Her wolf surged to the surface, howling in recognition. The bond snapped into place, a tether of steel connecting her mind to his. She could feel his heartbeat thudding against her back, steady and furious. She could smell him, not just the surface scent, but the deep underlying musk of the alpha. Roark pulled back slowly, licking the single drop of blood from the puncture wound to seal it. He lifted his head, his eyes glowing with a terrifying luminescence. The scent in the room changed instantly. The smell of mildew and dust was obliterated by the heavy, oppressive aroma of a mated alpha, burnt cedar, rain, and raw power. It rolled over the congregation like a physical wave, forcing the lower-ranking wolves to bare their necks in submission. "She is marked," Roark announced, his voice shaking the dust from the rafters. "She is the queen of the ironclad. Any debt she held is now royal debt, and I declare it paid. Any man who touches her touches the crown." He looked at Fallon, who was staring in horror at the fresh, silvering bite mark on Merritt's neck. The Beta looked ill, his face turning a sickly shade of green as the new pheromones hit him, repelling him biologically from the woman he had tried to own. "You wanted a breeder, Fallon," Roark spat. "Instead, you tried to steal my mate. Consider this your only warning. If you approach her again, I will dismantle your pack brick by brick. Roark didn't wait for a response. He scooped Merritt up into his arms, lifting her high against his chest. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coat to hide from the flashing cameras and the stunned stares of her parents. "Move out," Roark ordered his team. "We're done here." As they strode down the aisle, the guests parted like the Red Sea. Merritt risked a glance over Roark's shoulder. She saw Leo standing by the exit, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't looking at her with fear anymore. He was looking at her with awe. And behind him, her father sat with his head in his hands, weeping, though whether it was from relief or shame, Merritt couldn't tell. The cool air outside hit her face as Roark carried her down the crumbling steps to a waiting armored transport. He didn't set her down until they were inside the vehicle, the heavy doors slamming shut and sealing them in a quiet steel cocoon. The engine roared to life, putting miles between Merritt and the life she had just escaped. Chapter 8. Ironclad. The journey to the capital was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Merritt had passed out somewhere on the highway, her body overwhelmed by the metabolic shift of the marking. When she opened her eyes, the vibration of the road was gone. She was lying in a bed that felt like a cloud, surrounded by the soft hum of high-end climate control. She sat up, gasping. The room was cavernous, a masterpiece of brutalist architecture softened by luxury. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the ironclad territory, a sprawling metropolis of steel and light that made Ashen Vale look like a graveyard. Hover trains zipped between spires, and the sky was choked with industrial smog that glowed purple in the city lights. She looked down at herself. The wedding dress was gone. She was wearing a soft, oversized gray t-shirt and loose sleep shorts. Panic flared in her chest. She touched her neck. The mark was there, a raised scar that throbbed with a dull heat. "I didn't undress you," a voice came from the shadows. "The female medical staff did." Merritt whipped her head around. Roark was sitting in a leather armchair in the corner, watching her. He had changed out of his tactical gear into dark trousers and a simple black shirt, looking less like a warlord and more like a tired man. A datapad rested on his knee. "Where am I?" Merritt demanded, swinging her legs out of bed. The floor was heated. Even the floor was expensive. "The Obsidian Palace," Roark said calmly. "The Alpha's private wing. You've been asleep for 12 hours. 12 hours? Merritt stood up, her legs wobbly. "I need to go. My brother—" "Leo is safe," Roark cut in. "He was extracted from the ceremonial hall separately. He is currently settling into his dorm at the Royal Academy. His tuition is paid in full. Fallon can't touch him." Merritt stopped, the fight draining out of her. He had done it. He had actually done it. But the relief was quickly replaced by a new fear. She looked at Roark, at the power radiating off him even in repose. "And what about me? You marked me. You branded me like I was livestock. Am I just yours now? Did I just trade a beta for a king?" Roark stood up, setting the datapad aside. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "I didn't bite you to own you, Merritt. I bit you to give you diplomatic immunity." "Immunity?" Merritt frowned, crossing her arms over her chest. "Fallon isn't just a loan shark," Roark explained, his face grim. "He's a manufacturer. The poison you pulled out of me, Nightshade, it's not something you buy on the street. It requires a lab. If Fallon knew that you recognized the symptoms, that you knew how to treat it, he wouldn't have kept you as a wife. He would have killed you the moment the wedding night was over to tie up the loose end." Merritt felt the blood drain from her face. He made it?" "We suspect so," Roark said. "By marking you, I made you a queen. Under the law, you cannot be questioned, detained, or harmed by a lower-ranking wolf without it being an act of war. It was the only shield I had that was strong enough to stop him." Merritt looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself ready to catch her if she fell. So this is strategy? A political marriage? It's a protective detail, Roark corrected. But the bond is real. You feel it, don't you? Merritt swallowed hard. She did. It was a constant hum in the back of her mind, a sense of rightness that terrified her. I feel it. But I don't know you. You're the king. I'm just a medic from the slums. You're the woman who saved my life when I was nothing but a dying animal, Roark said softly. That makes you more than a medic. It makes you an equal. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the biometric scanner. Rest. There are clothes in the closet. When you're ready, come down to the dining hall. We have work to do. Fallon won't take this lying down. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving Merritt alone in the golden cage, touching the mark on her neck and wondering if she was strong enough to survive the man who had put it there. Chapter 9. The Golden Cage. By the afternoon, the silence of the suite was maddening. Merritt had paced the perimeter of the room 40 times. She had showered, scrubbing the scent of the ceremonial hall from her skin, but she couldn't scrub away the scent of Roark. It was embedded in her now. She dressed in the most practical thing she could find in the walk-in closet, a pair of black cargo pants and a fitted thermal top that looked like training gear. She refused to wear the silk dresses. She wasn't a doll. She slipped out of the suite, half expecting guards to stop her, but the hallway was empty. The palace was a labyrinth of cold stone and glass, silent and imposing. She followed the signs, avoiding the public areas, until the smell of antiseptic drew her like a beacon. The Royal Infirmary. She pushed through the double doors and stopped. It was like stepping into a sci-fi movie. Floating holoscreens displayed vitals, and droids whirred across the pristine white floors. But despite the tech, the air was thick with panic. A cluster of doctors in starched white coats were gathered around a biobed where a young guard was thrashing violently, restrained by magnetic cuffs. "Hold him down," shouted a balding man with a flushed face. Dr. Eris, the head physician. "His heart rate is spiking. Administer the sedative." "No!" Merritt shouted, the word tearing out of her before she could think. The room froze. Dr. Eris spun around, glaring at her. "Who are you? This is a restricted area. Security!" Merritt ignored him, marching to the bed. She looked at the guard's face. His lips were blue, his eyes rolling back, and froth was gathering at the corners of his mouth. She leaned in, sniffing the air near his neck. It smelled faint, like bitter almonds and burning plastic. "It's not a seizure," Merritt snapped. "Look at the localized rash on his neck. And the smell. It's a contact neurotoxin. Cyanide-based bonding agent. Probably from faulty gear lining." "Don't be ridiculous," Eris scoffed, puffing up his chest. "I am the royal physician. I know a seizure when I see one. Nurse, the sedative. If you sedate him, you'll suppress his respiratory drive and kill him," Merritt said, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. She shoved Eris aside. He stumbled back, shocked by her strength, and grabbed a localized distinct injector from the emergency crash cart. "He needs hydroxycobalamin. Now." "Do not let her touch him," Eris screamed. But the nurses hesitated. They saw the mark on Merritt's neck. They smelled the Alpha King on her. Fear of Roark outweighed fear of the doctor. Merritt didn't wait. She jammed the injector into the guard's thigh and depressed the plunger. For 5 agonizing seconds, the guard convulsed harder. Then he gasped, a ragged, wet sound, and his back arched. The thrashing stopped. His vitals on the monitor leveled out, the frantic beeping slowing to a steady rhythm. The blue tint began to fade from his lips. Merritt tossed the empty injector into the bio-waste bin and turned to Eris, who was gaping at her like a fish. "Check his helmet liner," Merritt said coldly. "And next time, smell your patient before you try to bury him." Slow clapping broke the silence. Merritt looked up. Roark was standing on the observation deck above, looking down through the glass partition. He wasn't wearing his crown or his coat. He was leaning on the railing, watching her with an expression she hadn't expected. It wasn't anger at her intrusion. It was pride. He turned and walked toward the stairs, descending to the infirmary floor. The staff scrambled to bow, but Roark walked straight to Merritt. He looked at the stabilizing guard, then at her. "Dr. Eris," Roark said, his voice mild but carrying a terrifying weight. "It seems my queen has a better grasp of toxicology than you do. Perhaps you should take notes." Merritt felt a flush heat her cheeks. He had called her my queen, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a title. It sounded like a partnership. Chapter 10. The Chemistry of Trust dinner was a quiet affair in the king's private dining room, a space that felt surprisingly intimate compared to the rest of the fortress. Rain lashed against the high windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. Merritt sat opposite Roark, picking at a plate of roasted venison that cost more than her parents' house. "You embarrassed Eris," Roark said, breaking the silence. He swirled the dark wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on her. "He submitted a formal complaint. He says you're reckless." "He's incompetent," Merritt replied without looking up. "He relies on the scanners too much." He stopped looking at the patient. "I agree," Roark said. He took a sip of wine. "That's why I rejected his resignation. I told him he answers to you now regarding all toxicity cases." Merritt dropped her fork. She stared at him. "You put me in charge?" "I'm not licensed in the Ironclad territory. I'm a hedge witch doctor from the Vale. You're the only one who figured out the nightshade variant," Roark said, leaning forward. The playfulness vanished, replaced by intensity. "The delay mechanism. The lipid shell you talked about. Eris missed it. You didn't." Merritt hesitated, then pulled a napkin toward her. She took a pen from her pocket and began to sketch a molecular structure. "It's brilliant chemistry, actually. Evil, but brilliant. Standard nightshade paralyzes the lungs instantly. But this..." She drew a circle around the core molecule. "They coated it in a synthetic lipid. It digests slowly. It means the poison doesn't hit the bloodstream until hours after injection. That's why you made it to the woods. They wanted you to die away from the palace." "Why?" Roark asked, watching her hand move. "To prevent an autopsy," Merritt explained. "If you die in the wild, scavengers eat the evidence. Or the lipid breaks down completely, leaving no trace. It looks like a heart attack." Roark was silent for a long moment. "Fallon isn't smart enough to invent this. He's a thug." "He's a financier," Merritt corrected. "He bought the recipe, or he hired someone. But the manufacturing, that requires a massive facility. Ventilation, cooling vats. You can't do this in a basement." "We've scanned his territory," Roark said, frustrated. "Satellites show nothing. Just old mines." "Mines," Merritt whispered, her eyes widening. "Underground. Roark, the ventilation wouldn't go up. It would go into the earth filters. That's why you can't see the heat signature." The realization hung between them. They weren't just a king and a consort anymore. They were a tactician and a scientist, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Merritt felt a thrill that had nothing to do with the bond. She was useful here. She was dangerous. Roark looked at her, and the respect in his eyes was heady. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "We need to prove it. If we can find the site..." A blaring siren cut him off. The room was bathed in sudden, pulsing red light. The security lockdown alarm. Roark was on his feet instantly, his chair scraping back. He tapped his comms bead. "Report. Perimeter breach at the main gate." The guard's voice crackled, sounding strained. "Sir, it's Beta Fallon. He's back." Merritt stood up, her heart plummeting. "He can't be. You exiled him." "He's not attacking," the guard continued. "He's surrendering. He says he has evidence. He says he has proof that Queen Merritt is the one who poisoned you." Roark looked at Merritt. his face a mask of stone. "Stay here." "No," Merritt said, walking around the table to stand beside him. She checked the knife she had strapped to her thigh under the cargo pants. "He's coming for me. I'm not hiding in the bedroom while you fight my battles." Roark studied her for a second, then nodded. "Then stay close. And don't say a word unless I tell you to." They walked out of the room together, into the storm that was waiting at the gates. Chapter 11. The Arrival of the Enemy. The main doors to the Obsidian Palace were designed to withstand a siege, reinforced with blast-proof alloys and biometric locks that required a genetic match to open. Yet, when the security override codes were inputted by the High Council, those massive barriers slid open with a terrifyingly smooth hiss. Merritt stood beside Roark in the grand foyer, her hand hovering near the knife concealed beneath her cargo pants, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She expected an army. She expected gunfire. But what walked through the doors was far more dangerous than a battalion of soldiers. Beta Fallon entered first, flanked not by warriors, but by a phalanx of lawyers in sharp suits and Elder Dorian, who clutched a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Fallon looked immaculate. His suit was tailored, his hair perfectly coiffed, and the bruise on his jaw from Roark's strike at the wedding had been covered with expensive concealer. He didn't look like a man who had been exiled. He looked like a man who owned the building. Behind him, the High Council members, 5 ancient wolves draped in ceremonial robes, shuffled in with grim expressions. They were the legislative branch of the Ironclad, the only power that could theoretically check the king's authority. Roark stepped forward, his body acting as a physical shield between Merritt and the intruders. His growl was low and vibrated through the marble floor, a sound of pure warning that made the lawyers flinch. "I exiled you, Fallon. Your presence here is a capital offense. Give me one reason why I shouldn't execute you where you stand." Fallon stopped 10 paces away, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. His eyes flicked to Merritt, gleaming with a malice that made her skin crawl. "I am here under the protection of the Whistleblower Act, Your Majesty. I have brought evidence of a plot against the crown. A plot so insidious that it has already compromised the throne itself." One of the council members, a gray-haired woman named Elder Vane, stepped forward. Her voice was brittle. "Beta Fallon approached us with disturbing documentation, King Roark. We are compelled by law to hear him out. If his claims are true, the security of the entire kingdom is at risk." "His claims are lies," Roark spat, his fists clenching at his sides. "He is the manufacturer of the nightshade toxin. He is trying to deflect." "Am I?" Fallon asked softly. He snapped his fingers, and Dorian hurried forward, opening the briefcase on a portable table. He pulled out a holographic projector and set it down. "Or am I the only one willing to see the truth? We all know the king was poisoned. We all know he was saved by a miracle medic from the slums. But doesn't it seem convenient? That a girl with no money, no prospects, and a desperate need to save her brother just happened to have the exact skills needed to treat a military-grade neurotoxin in the middle of the woods?" Merritt stepped out from behind Roark, her anger overriding her fear. "I treated him because I found him dying. I didn't know who he was." "Didn't you?" Fallon pressed a button on the projector. A grainy video feed flickered to life in the air between them. It showed Merritt in the Forbidden Woods, weeks ago. She was kneeling by a stream, harvesting purple flowers. Monkshood. Then, the video cut to a time-stamped log of her internet search history from the clinic computer. Neurotoxin synthesis, lipid binding agents, alpha physiology. "Context is everything," Fallon narrated, his voice smooth as oil. "Here we see the future queen harvesting poisonous ingredients, and here, researching how to create a time-release agent. Why would a country doctor need to know how to delay the effects of a poison, unless she was planning to administer it?" "That's research for antidotes," Merritt shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "I treat miners who get exposed to chemical runoff. And this? Fallon produced a physical ledger, slamming it onto the table. "This is the financial record from your father's house, Merritt. It shows a purchase order for synthesized cyanide and aconite precursors, dated 2 months ago, signed by Magnus Prescott." The room went deadly silent. Merritt stared at the ledger, the blood draining from her face. She knew her father was a gambler, but he wasn't a killer. Yet, the signature was there. She looked at Roark, panic rising in her throat. She saw the doubt flicker in the eyes of the council members. They were looking at her not as a queen, but as an assassin who had slept her way into the highest seat of power. "This is a frame-up," Roark said, his voice deadly calm, though Merritt could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. Magnus Prescott was under Fallon's financial thumb. Anything he signed was likely coerced. "Can you prove that?" Elder Vane asked sharply. "Because right now, the evidence suggests that Merritt Prescott poisoned you herself to create a trauma bond, force a mating, and secure immunity for her family. It is a textbook infiltration strategy. I demand a tribunal," Fallon said, smiling his shark-like smile. "If she is innocent, let her stand trial. If she is guilty, then the marking is void, and she must be executed for regicide and treason." Roark bared his teeth, his wolf surfacing. "She is my mate. There will be no trial." "Then you are complicit," Fallon countered, "and the council will remove you both." Merritt looked at the soldiers lining the walls. Their hands were tightening on their weapons. The council had their own loyalists. If Roark fought this now, it would be a civil war inside the palace. They were trapped. "Fine," Merritt said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped forward, ignoring Roark's sharp intake of breath. "I'll stand trial, and I will prove you're a liar, Fallon." Chapter 12. The Frame-Up. The High Council chamber was a circular amphitheater of black stone, designed to intimidate anyone who stood in the center pit. Merritt stood there now, alone, the cold spotlights blinding her. The 5 elders sat on raised podiums above her, looking down like vultures waiting for a carcass. Roark had been forced to sit in the royal box, separated from her by a force field that prevented him from physically intervening. Merritt could see him pacing, his hands pressed against the transparent barrier, his eyes burning with helpless fury. Fallon paced the floor like a prosecuting attorney, holding the ledger aloft for the gallery to see. The room was packed with nobles and military officials, all whispering, all judging. "The narrative is simple," Fallon addressed the council, his voice projecting clearly without a microphone. "Merritt Prescott was desperate. Her family was destitute. She needed a way out. She didn't want to marry me, a humble beta, so she aimed higher. She synthesized a low-dosage variant of nightshade, something that wouldn't kill the king immediately, but would incapacitate him. She planted it. She waited. And then, she played the hero." "That's insane," Merritt interrupted, gripping the railing of the witness stand. "I found him by accident. If I wanted to kill him, why would I save him?" "Munchausen syndrome by proxy," Fallon countered smoothly, turning to face her. "The hero complex. You didn't want him dead, Merritt. You wanted him grateful. You wanted him dependent on you. And it worked, didn't it? You saved him. And in his delirious state, he brought you here. He made you queen. You went from a debtor's daughter to the most powerful woman in the territory overnight." "I treated him with supplies I stole," Merritt argued, trying to keep her voice steady. "If I had planned this, wouldn't I have had the antidote ready? I had to synthesize it in the dirt." "Or so you claim," Fallon said. "But we only have your word for that, and your word is worth very little, considering your father's involvement." He gestured to the screen where a video testimony from Magnus Prescott began to play. Magnus looked terrified, sitting in an interrogation room. "Did you buy the chemicals, Magnus?" an off-screen voice asked. I signed for them," Magnus stammered on the screen. "But I didn't know what they were for. Merritt asked me to. She said she needed them for the clinic." Merritt gasped, her knees nearly buckling. "It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Or Fallon had tortured him until he said it. But to the council, it looked like a confession. "My father is afraid of you," Merritt shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Fallon. "You threatened to send my brother to the war. You own him." "I own his debt," Fallon corrected. "I do not own his conscience. He confessed because he couldn't live with the guilt of treason." Elder Vane leaned forward, looking down at Merritt with disdain. "The evidence is compelling, Queen Merritt. You have medical knowledge. You had access to the chemicals. You had the motive. And the king's judgment is clearly compromised by the mating bond. He cannot see the truth because his biology is blinding him." "The bond is the truth," Roark roared from the box, slamming his fist against the barrier. "I know her mind. I know she is innocent." "The bond can be manipulated," Fallon said dismissively. "Trauma bonds mimic mating bonds. She drugged you, Roark. She tricked your wolf into thinking she was your savior." The council murmured in agreement. The trap was perfect. Fallon used Merritt's greatest strength, her intelligence, against her. He twisted her competence into malice. "We have heard enough," Elder Vane announced, banging her gavel. "The council will vote." Merritt watched in horror as the 5 lights above the elders' seats turned red, one by one. Unanimous. "Merritt Prescott," Vane declared, her voice echoing like a death knell. "You are found guilty of high treason, attempted regicide, and biological manipulation of the crown. The sentence is death." "Veto!" Roark shouted, the sound so loud it cracked the glass of the barrier. "I invoke the royal veto. You cannot execute my mate." "We can if the mating is fraudulent," Vane shot back. "But, to avoid a civil war, we will grant a stay of execution pending a full biological review. Until then, she is to be remanded to the silver cells. Solitary confinement. No contact." "You can't do this," Merritt whispered, looking at Fallon. He was smiling. He had won. He hadn't just framed her. He had isolated her. "Take her away," Vane ordered. Guards, not Roark's men, but council security, swarmed the pit. They grabbed Merritt's arms. She didn't fight. She looked up at Roark one last time. He wasn't raging anymore. He was staring at her with a terrifying, cold resolve. He was planning, and she had to stay alive long enough for him to act. Chapter 13. The Silver Cells. The Silver Cells were not designed for comfort. They were designed to break the spirit of alpha-class criminals. Located deep beneath the palace foundation, the walls were lined with a silver alloy mesh that dampened werewolf abilities. The moment the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing Merritt inside, she felt the connection to her wolf sever. It was like going blind and deaf at the same time. The hum of the bond, the constant reassuring presence of Roark in the back of her mind, vanished into static. Merritt sank onto the cold cot, wrapping her arms around herself. The silence was absolute. No heartbeat, no distant thoughts, just the damp drip of condensation and her own jagged breathing. She was alone in a way she hadn't been since the woods. Hours passed, or maybe days. There were no windows, only a harsh strip of light that never flickered. Merritt paced the small cell to keep her muscles warm, her mind racing. Fallon's plan was airtight. He had covered every angle. The ledger, the video, her father's coerced confession. Legally, she was dead. There was no appeal process for treason. Suddenly, the biometric lock on the door beeped. Not the harsh buzz of the guard rotation, but a series of rapid, unauthorized clicks. The heavy door hissed open. Merritt scrambled back, expecting an executioner. Instead, a figure slipped inside, moving with silent urgency. It was Roark. But he wasn't wearing his crown or his coat. He was dressed in black tactical stealth gear, his face obscured by a hood until he pulled it back. "Roark," she breathed, rushing toward him. He caught her, pulling her into a crushing embrace. The moment they touched, the static in her head cleared slightly. The silver dampeners couldn't block physical contact. She felt his fear, his rage, and his overwhelming relief. I have 5 minutes, he whispered against her hair. I looped the security feed, but the council has sensors everywhere. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Merritt said, pulling back to look at him. Just cold. Roark, you shouldn't be here. If they catch you, they'll say you're aiding a traitor. They'll strip your crown. Let them take it, Roark growled. I'm getting you out. I have a transport waiting on the south pad. We can run. Go to the neutral lands. And leave Fallon in charge? Merritt shook her head, her hands gripping his arms. That's what he wants. He wants you to run so he can declare the throne vacant. He'll take over the Ironclad and he'll use the Nightshade to subjugate the other packs. We can't run. We can't stay, Roark argued, his eyes desperate. The execution is scheduled for dawn, Merritt. They aren't waiting for a review. Vane lied. They're going to kill you to break the bond. Merritt froze. Dawn. She had less than 6 hours. The desperation clarified her mind. The fear evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard logic of a surgeon facing a terminal diagnosis. Radical action was required. We can't win legally, Merritt said, her voice steady. And we can't win by force. Fallon has the council's backing. We have to give him what he wants. What are you talking about? He wants the bond broken, Merritt said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. He wants me back under his control because I'm the only one who knows the chemical formula. He needs me to refine the poison. That's why he framed me instead of killing me in the woods. He needs a chemist. I am not handing you over to him, Roark snapped. You have to, Merritt insisted. It's the only way to get inside the bunker. We know it's underground, but we don't know where. If I go with him, I can track it. No, Roark grabbed her shoulders. It's suicide. Once he has you, he'll lock you in a lab and throw away the key. Not if you know where I am, Merritt said. The isotope, the radioactive tracer you use for missile guidance. If I swallow a capsule, I become a beacon. Roark stared at her, horror warring with admiration in his eyes. Merritt, that isotope is toxic if the casing breaks, and even if it works. You want me to publicly denounce you? To pretend I believe his lies? We have to sell it, Merritt said, reaching up to cup his face. We have to make it look real. I have to break your heart in front of the whole world. It's the only way Fallon will believe he's won. Chapter 14. The Trojan Horse. The plan was madness. It relied on timing, acting, and a terrifying amount of trust. For the next 4 minutes, huddled in the corner of the prison cell, they hammered out the details. Roark was resistant, his protective instincts screaming against using his mate as bait. But Merritt was relentless. She walked him through the logic, stripping away his emotional arguments until only the strategic necessity remained. I need access to the lab before the hearing, Merritt said. Can you get me the isotope? I can have it hidden in the medical processing bay, Roark said, his voice hollow. When they process you for release, or transfer, you'll have a window. Good, Merritt said. Then we do it. At the hearing tomorrow, I'll confess. I'll say I did it to save my brother. I'll say I hate you. Roark looked away, his jaw working. I don't know if I can do this, Merritt. I don't know if I can stand there and let him take you. You are the Alpha King, Merritt said fiercely, forcing him to look at her. You do what is necessary to save the pack, and right now, I am the weapon you need to fire. The comms unit on Roark's wrist buzzed. His time was up. The loop on the security feed was about to reset. I have to go, Roark said, looking at the door like he wanted to rip it off its hinges. He turned back to her, pulling her close for one desperate, searing kiss. It tasted of salt and fear. If he touches you, if he hurts you. He won't, Merritt promised, though she didn't know if it was true. He needs my brain. Just watch the scanner. When the beacon lights up, come for me. I will burn the world down to find you, Roark vowed. He slipped out of the cell, the heavy door slamming shut, plunging Merritt back into silence. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a countdown. She sat on the cot, closing her eyes, rehearsing the lies she would have to tell to save the man she loved. She had to be convincing. She had to be cruel. She had to destroy her own reputation to save the kingdom. The dawn came too quickly. Guards arrived, shackling her hands and feet. They marched her up from the depths of the earth, through the silent palace, to the grand hall. The atmosphere was different today. It wasn't a trial. It was a spectacle. Cameras were broadcasting live to every territory. Fallon stood at the front, looking smug. Roark sat on the throne, his face a mask of granite, his eyes dead. Merritt took a breath, summoning every ounce of rage and pain she had felt over the last month. She imagined Fallon threatening Leo. She imagined her parents' betrayal. She channeled it all into the performance of a lifetime. Chapter 15. The Performance. The grand hall was silent as Merritt was led to the podium. She looked ragged, her hair messy, her eyes rimmed with red. Not makeup, but the result of a sleepless night in the silver cells. She looked broken. Perfect. Elder Vane read the charges again. Merritt Prescott, you have been sentenced to death. Do you have any final words before the sentence is carried out? Merritt gripped the podium, her knuckles white. She looked at Roark. He didn't blink. He stared through her. I want to make a deal, Merritt stammered, her voice cracking for the microphones. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Fallon stepped forward, his interest piqued. What kind of deal? I don't want to die, Merritt sobbed, letting the tears fall. I did it, okay? I did it. I poisoned him, but I didn't do it for power. I did it because I was scared. My family was starving. I just wanted a way out. She turned to Roark, screaming the words. I never loved you. You're a monster. You're a killer. I hate being your queen. I hate this cold metal prison. I just wanted the money. The crowd gasped. Roark stood up slowly, his expression shifting from stoic to devastated, then to a terrifying, cold fury. It was masterful. You admit it? Roark asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. You admit the bond is a lie? Yes, Merritt shrieked. It's all a lie. Just let me go. I'll annul the marriage. I'll go back to the Vale. Just don't kill me. She turned to Fallon, falling to her knees. Please, Beta Fallon. You wanted me, right? You wanted a wife? Take me back. I'll sign the contract. I'll do whatever you want. Just save me from him. Fallon looked at the kneeling queen, then at the devastated king. His ego swelled. He saw a broken woman begging for his protection, rejecting the most powerful alpha in the world for him. It was the ultimate victory. Your Majesty, Fallon addressed Roark, struggling to hide his grin. If the queen confesses and agrees to an annulment, surely execution is unnecessary. She is clearly unstable, a product of her environment. If you release her to my custody, I will ensure she is rehabilitated and out of your sight forever. Roark looked at Merritt, disgust written on every feature. He took off his crown and set it on the table. She is no queen of mine, Roark spat. The bond is rejected. Take her. Get her out of my city before I tear her throat out myself. As you wish, Fallon said, bowing low. He walked over to Merritt, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. Come along, my dear. We have a lot of work to do. As Fallon dragged her out of the hall, Merritt risked one final look back. Roark had turned his back to the room, looking out the window. His shoulders were shaking. The court thought he was weeping. Merritt knew he was checking his watch. The game was on. Chapter 16. The Isotope. The walk from the Grand Hall to the transfer bay was a gauntlet of humiliation designed to strip away whatever dignity Merritt had left. The press had been allowed into the corridor, their cameras flashing in a blinding stroboscopic rhythm that disoriented her, capturing every tear and every tremble of her frame. To the world, she was the fallen queen, the traitor who had confessed to poisoning a hero. To the soldiers lining the walls, she was a pariah. They looked at her with undisguised loathing, their hands resting on their weapons as if they were itching for an excuse to end her treason right there on the red carpet. Merritt kept her head down, letting her hair shield her face, sobbing loudly enough to sell the performance, though her mind was calculating the seconds with cold, surgical precision. Beta Fallon walked beside her, his hand gripping her upper arm in a parody of support. To the cameras, it looked like he was steadying a distraught woman. In reality, his fingers were digging into her muscle with bruising force, a silent reminder that she was now his property again. He steered her toward the medical processing unit near the exit, a mandatory checkpoint for anyone leaving the royal zone to ensure they weren't carrying biological contagions or stolen tech. This was the bottleneck. This was the only chance she had. Inside the sterile white room, the noise of the press was cut off by the heavy slide of the blast doors. A nurse was waiting, a young woman with a severe bob cut and eyes that darted nervously toward the Beta. Merritt recognized her, Nurse Kyla, one of the few staff members in the infirmary who had actually listened to Merritt during the cyanide incident. Kyla didn't look at Merritt with hate. She looked at her with a terrifying intensity. "Standard exit protocol," Fallon announced, leaning against the doorframe, refusing to leave the room. "Scan her, check for royal property, and give her something to shut her up. Her crying is giving me a migraine." Kyla nodded stiffly, gesturing for Merritt to sit on the exam table. She ran a handheld scanner over Merritt's body, the device beeping rhythmically. Merritt held her breath. She wasn't wearing a wire. Fallon would have found it, but she was terrified the scanner might pick up the sheer erratic speed of her heartbeat. Kyla moved the scanner over Merritt's neck, lingering on the fading bite mark. For a second, the nurse's eyes met Merritt's, and a silent message passed between them. "Clean," Kyla announced, her voice flat. She turned to the counter and poured a small paper cup of water, then popped a blister pack containing a single, unassuming blue capsule. "This is a sedative. It will help with the hysteria." Fallon watched like a hawk, his eyes narrowing. "What is it? Diazepam?" "A generic stabilizer," Kyla replied, walking over to Merritt. She held out the cup and the pill. "Doctor's orders for high-stress transport." Merritt looked at the blue pill. It wasn't a stabilizer. It was a micro-encapsulated radioactive isotope, usually used for tracking blood flow in cardiac imaging, but modified by the Royal Labs to act as a high-frequency geolocation beacon. It had a battery life of 24 hours and a casing designed to dissolve in stomach acid within 30 minutes. Once the casing breached, she would light up on Roark's tactical map like a solar flare. "Drink it," Fallon ordered, checking his watch. "We're losing time." Merritt took the pill with a trembling hand, playing the part of the broken victim to the end. She placed it on her tongue, the casing tasting faintly of chalk, and swallowed it with a gulp of water. She opened her mouth to show Fallon it was gone. He sneered, satisfied. "Let's go," Fallon said, grabbing her arm again and hauling her off the table. "The car is waiting." As Merritt was dragged toward the exit, she risked one last glance at Kyla. The nurse was already busy wiping down the counter, her back turned, but her hand was resting over her heart in a silent salute. Merritt swallowed hard, feeling the pill slide down her throat, a tiny, ticking time bomb of hope. She stepped out into the humid air of the loading dock, where Fallon's armored transport waited like a hearse, ready to carry her back to hell. Chapter 17. Into the Dark. The interior of the armored SUV smelled of expensive leather and stale cigar smoke, a cloying combination that made Merritt's stomach turn. The windows were tinted so darkly that the world outside was reduced to a murky gray blur, reinforcing the feeling that she had been swallowed whole. Fallon sat opposite her in the spacious rear cabin, his legs crossed, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. The partition between them and the driver was raised, sealing them in a soundproof bubble of intimacy that felt more dangerous than a cage match. For the first 20 minutes, Fallon didn't speak. He just watched her, swirling his drink, savoring his victory. Merritt sat huddled in the corner, staring at her hands, waiting for the isotope to dissolve. She needed to keep him talking. She needed to keep him distracted so he wouldn't notice if she started sweating when the tracer activated. "Why?" Merritt asked, her voice raspy. She dropped the hysterical act, replacing it with a dull, defeated curiosity. "You have the money. You have the territory. Why go through all this trouble for me? There are plenty of wolves with better bloodlines." Fallon chuckled, a low, wet sound. He took a sip of his scotch. "It's not just about biology, Merritt. Though admittedly your genetic markers are exceptional. It's about the principle of the thing. You see, your father didn't just owe me money. He insulted me." Merritt frowned, looking up. "My father is a coward. He wouldn't insult a fly." "He tried to pay me off," Fallon said, his smile vanishing. "Years ago, before the gambling got bad. He tried to buy back the deed to your land with a loan from the Royal Bank. He wanted to cut me out of the Ashen Vale development deal. He thought he was being clever." Fallon leaned forward, his eyes cold. "So I introduced him to the tables. I introduced him to the high-stakes games where the house never loses because I am the house. I didn't just lend him money, Merritt. I engineered his ruin. Every debt he accrued, every bad beat, every desperate loan extension, I orchestrated it. I turned him into a slave, and I made sure the only currency he had left to pay me with was you." Merritt felt a chill run through her marrow. She had spent years resenting her parents for their weakness, for their inability to manage their lives. But they hadn't been incompetent. They had been targeted. Fallon had groomed her family for destruction just to secure a breeding asset. "They aren't villains," Merritt whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "They're victims." "They are pawns," Fallon corrected. "And pawns are sacrificed to protect the king, or in this case the Beta." He sat back, looking pleased with himself. "But don't worry, I'm a benevolent owner. Once we arrive at the facility, you'll have a nice, comfortable room. You won't see the sun much, but you'll have everything you need to work." "Work?" Merritt asked, feigning confusion. "I thought I was going to be a wife." "Oh, please, the marriage is a formality," Fallon scoffed. "I saw the video of you in the woods, Merritt. I know you synthesized a stabilizer for the nightshade. Do you have any idea how hard that is? My scientists have been trying to stabilize the reactant for months. They keep killing the test subjects too quickly." He pointed his glass at her. "You have a gift, and you are going to use it to refine my product. You are going to make the nightshade undetectable." Merritt's blood ran cold. He didn't just want a breeder. He wanted a weapon maker. He was going to chain her to a lab bench and force her to create the very poison she had sworn to fight. "And if I refuse?" Merritt challenged, testing his limits. "Then I send a sample of the virus to the Royal Academy," Fallon said casually. "I hear the dorms are quite crowded. It would be a tragedy if an outbreak occurred. Your brother Leo, he has a weak immune system, doesn't he?" The threat was precise and devastating. Merritt clamped her mouth shut, her hand drifting to her stomach. She could feel the faint warmth spreading in her gut. The casing was dissolving. The signal was live. She looked out the window, praying that Roark was watching the map, praying that the man she had just publicly destroyed still loved her enough to come for her. Chapter 18. The Bunker. The transport didn't head toward the residential district of Ashen Vale. Instead, it turned off the main highway onto a gravel service road that wound deep into the old mining sector. A scarred, desolate landscape of stripped earth and abandoned machinery. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the quarries, making the place look like the surface of a dead planet. Merritt knew this place. It was the Iron Tooth Quarry, officially closed a decade ago due to structural instability. The SUV approached a massive, rusted blast door set into the side of a granite cliff. Two guards in heavy armor stepped out of a camouflaged sentry booth, scanning the vehicle before waving it through. The blast doors groaned open, revealing a tunnel that plunged straight down into the earth. As they descended, the air pressure changed, popping Merritt's ears. The smell of expensive leather was replaced by the smell of sulfur, harsh chemicals, and recycled air. "Welcome home," Fallon said as the car came to a halt in a subterranean loading bay. Merritt stepped out, her boots hitting the concrete floor. The scale of the operation took her breath away. This wasn't a basement lab. It was an industrial complex. Catwalks crisscrossed the high ceiling, and massive stainless steel vats hummed with activity. Men in hazmat suits moved with purpose, monitoring pressure gauges and adjusting valves. In the center of the room, a series of glass containment units held wolves in various stages of distress. The test subjects Fallon had mentioned. "It's impressive, isn't it?" Fallon said, walking up beside her. He gestured to the vats. "We're currently producing 50 gallons of nightshade concentrate a week, enough to paralyze an army, but the delivery system is still flawed. It degrades too fast in aerosol form." "You want to gas them?" Merritt said, horror dawning on her. "You don't just want to assassinate individuals. You want mass casualties." "I want leverage," Fallon corrected. "The ironclad territory relies on its military supremacy. If I can neutralize the royal barracks in one night, the king has no claws. I become the de facto ruler of the region without firing a single shot." He turned to her, his eyes gleaming with madness. "And you are going to fix the aerosol decay, Merritt. You start tomorrow." He grabbed her arm and led her toward a heavy steel door on the far side of the bay. "But first, let's get you settled. I've prepared a suite for you. It's right next to the command center, so I can keep an eye on you." They passed a control room filled with monitors displaying security feeds from the tunnels. Merritt's eyes darted to the screens. She saw external cameras, thermal sensors, and motion detectors. The security was tight, but it was focused outward. They were expecting an attack from the ground, not a sabotage from within. Fallon swiped his hand over a biometric pad, and the door to her suite opened. It was a glorified cell, furnished with a bed, a desk, and a small adjoining bathroom. There were no windows, obviously, but there was a ventilation grate near the ceiling, humming softly. "Get some rest," Fallon said, pushing her inside. "I'll have dinner sent down. Don't try to leave. The corridors are patrolled by wolves who have been instructed to break your legs if you step past the threshold." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a heavy thud. Merritt stood in the center of the room, listening to the retreating footsteps. She waited a full minute, counting the seconds, before she rushed to the bathroom. She locked the door, turned on the faucet to create white noise, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked terrified, but beneath the fear, her eyes were hard. The isotope was active. She was in the heart of the beast. Now she just had to kill it. Chapter 19. The Signal and the Sabotage. Merritt sat on the edge of the toilet seat, staring at her wristwatch. It had been 40 minutes since she swallowed the pill. By her calculations, the signal should be strong, pulsing a steady rhythm to the tactical command center in the ironclad palace. She imagined Roark standing over the holotable, watching the blinking red dot deep beneath the earth, his face set in that terrifyingly stoic mask he wore before violence. She had to believe he was coming. If he wasn't, she was going to die in this hole. But waiting for rescue wasn't Merritt's style. Roark could breach the doors, but Fallon had an army of guards and vats of poison. If a firefight broke out in the lab, a stray bullet could rupture a containment unit and kill everyone, including Roark. She had to neutralize the threat from the inside. She stood up and inspected the bathroom. It was Spartan. A sink, a toilet, a small shower stall, and a cabinet under the sink stocked with basic cleaning supplies. Fallon's arrogance was his blind spot. He assumed a doctor was only dangerous with a scalpel. He forgot that chemistry was the foundation of all medicine. Merritt opened the cabinet. Her eyes landed on 2 plastic jugs, a gallon of industrial-strength bleach and a bottle of ammonia-based glass cleaner. A grim smile touched her lips. It was the most basic, dangerous mistake in household cleaning, and here it was, handed to her on a silver platter. Chloramine gas. In a confined space, it was devastating. It burned the eyes, the throat, and the lungs, causing immediate incapacitation. It wasn't lethal in short bursts if the victim could get fresh air, but it would drop a room full of guards in seconds. She needed a delivery system. She looked up at the ventilation grate in the ceiling. It was screwed in place, but the metal looked thin. The system was clearly recycling air from the main lab. She could smell the faint, acrid tang of the chemicals from the vats. If the air came in, it could also go out. If she could reverse the flow or simply introduce the gas into the main intake, she could flood the lab. She climbed onto the toilet tank, balancing precariously, and inspected the grate. She used the handle of her toothbrush, snapping the plastic to create a crude shiv and wedged it into the screw head. It was slow, frustrating work, her knuckles scraping against the rough ceiling, but eventually, the first screw gave way. Then the second. The grate swung open. A draft of cool air hit her face. She peered inside. The duct was narrow, but she was smaller than the average wolf. It led straight toward the rumble of the main air handler. She jumped down and grabbed the bleach and ammonia. She needed a mixing vessel. The trash can was too small. She looked at the shower. It had a detachable head and a drain. No, that wouldn't work. She needed portable chaos. She grabbed the plastic trash liner, doubling it up to prevent leaks. Suddenly, a siren wailed in the distance. Not the fire alarm, the perimeter alarm. Roark. He was early. He was attacking the main blast doors. That meant Fallon would be distracted. It also meant the guards would be rushing to the entrance, leaving the lab floor exposed. But it also meant Fallon might panic and release the nightshade as a defense mechanism. Merritt poured the bleach into the bag, the smell already sharp and stinging. She held the ammonia bottle ready. She climbed back up to the vent, shoving the bag of bleach into the duct first. She pulled herself up, her shoulders scraping the metal, dragging her chemical weapon with her. She crawled toward the sound of the fans, the darkness closing in. She was the virus now. She was the poison in the vein. Chapter 20. Chemistry in Action. The ventilation shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare. Dust and grime coated Merritt's skin, and the vibration of the massive industrial fans rattled her teeth. She crawled on her elbows and knees, dragging the sloshing bag of bleach, the bottle of ammonia clutched in her other hand. Below her, through the slats of the vents she passed, she could see the chaos unfolding in the lab. Red emergency lights pulsed, casting the facility in a hellish glow. Guards were running toward the freight elevator, shouting orders. Scientists were scrambling to secure data drives. And in the center of the room, standing on the catwalk overlooking the vats, was Beta Fallon. He was screaming into a comms unit, his face twisted in fury. "Hold the gate," Fallon roared. "If they breach, flush the system. Dump the nightshade into the external vents. If I go down, I'm taking the Royal Army with me." Merritt's heart stopped. He was going to release the toxin into the atmosphere. It would kill Roark's men instantly, and depending on the wind, it could drift toward the residential areas of Ashen Vale. She had to stop him. Now. She reached the main intake junction. This was where the air was pulled from the room, filtered and recirculated. A massive fan blade spun below her, a metal maw hungry for air. If she dropped the mixture here, the fan would disperse it instantly throughout the entire facility. Merritt braced herself. She needed to protect her own lungs. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth, tying the sleeves tight behind her head. It wasn't a gas mask, but it would buy her a few seconds. She opened the bottle of ammonia and poured it into the bag of bleach. The reaction was instant and violent. The liquid hissed and bubbled, releasing a thick, white cloud of chloramine vapor. Merritt's eyes watered immediately, burning as if she had rubbed them with chili peppers. She shoved the bag through the grate, directly into the spinning blades of the intake fan. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The fan shredded the plastic bag, catching the chemical slurry and flinging it outward in a fine mist. The white gas exploded into the ventilation system, pumped at high velocity into every room of the bunker. Merritt scrambled backward, coughing, her throat seizing up. She needed to get out of the duct before the backdraft caught her. She kicked the grate of a side vent loose, one that led to a storage closet she had spotted earlier on the monitors. She fell through the opening, landing hard on a pile of hazmat suits. She gasped for air, grabbing one of the full-face respirators hanging on the wall. She jammed it over her face, the rubber seal sucking tight against her skin. She took a deep breath. Filtered air. Sweet, clean oxygen. She kicked the door of the closet open and stepped out onto the catwalk. The scene below was absolute pandemonium. The gas had hit the floor. Guards were doubling over, clutching their throats, their eyes streaming tears. The scientists were blindly stumbling into walls, incapacitated by the burning fog. The chloramine was doing its job. It was blinding, choking, and terrifying. But Fallon was still standing. He had pulled a gas mask from an emergency box on the wall and was fitting it over his face. He looked up, his eyes scanning the catwalks through the haze. He saw her. He didn't run. He drew a high-caliber pistol and aimed it directly at her chest. "You!" Fallon's voice was muffled by the mask, but the hate was unmistakable. Boom! The main blast doors at the far end of the lab buckled. Metal screamed as claws tore through reinforced steel. A massive black shape exploded into the room, followed by a squad of wolves in tactical armor. The Midnight Reaper had arrived. Roark's wolf was a terrifying sight, a blur of shadow and violence. He didn't stop to assess the gas. His alpha physiology could withstand the chemical assault longer than a human or a lesser wolf. He locked onto Fallon instant. Fallon fired. The bullet sparked off the railing inches from Merritt's hip. She didn't flinch. She grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox and vaulted over the railing, dropping onto the control platform. She wasn't just a distraction anymore. She was the executioner. Chapter 21. The Breach. The destruction of the blast door was a sensory overload that momentarily drowned out the hissing of the chloramine gas. Metal shrieked as it was torn from the reinforced concrete frame, the massive steel slab crumpling like tin foil under the assault of the Alpha King's fury. Through the swirling white fog of the chemical reaction, Roark's wolf form, the Midnight Reaper, emerged like a nightmare taking physical shape. He was massive, his black fur matted with dust and debris, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were stained with the oil and hydraulic fluid of the barrier he had just dismantled. He wasn't breathing. He was holding his breath against the caustic air, his golden eyes burning with a terrifying luminosity as they swept the catwalks, searching for the only thing that mattered. Merritt stood on the control platform, clutching the heavy wrench, her chest heaving behind the rubber seal of the gas mask. Through the scratched plastic visor, she watched the royal guard pour into the facility behind their king. They were professional, moving in a tight formation with full-face respirators, their tactical lights cutting beams through the haze. They fired non-lethal suppression rounds into the chaos below, dropping the few scientists and mercenaries who were still trying to scramble for weapons while coughing up the lining of their lungs. The bunker, once a fortress of sterile cruelty, had descended into absolute anarchy. Fallon, shielded by his own mask, realized his army had fallen before the battle had even truly begun. He abandoned his position near the railing and sprinted toward the main control console on the far side of the platform. Merritt saw his intent immediately: the emergency purge valve. If he couldn't vent the nightshade into the atmosphere, he would dump the raw concentrate into the groundwater. It would poison the water table for 50 miles, killing everything in Ashen Vale within a week. It was a scorched earth policy born of pure spite. "Roark!" Merritt screamed, though her voice was muffled by the mask. She pointed frantically at Fallon. "The console! Stop him!" Roark didn't need the verbal command. He followed the line of her arm. He launched himself from the ground floor, his claws digging into the steel mesh of the support beams. He scaled the 20-foot vertical drop with impossible speed, a blur of muscle and kinetic energy. He cleared the railing just as Fallon reached the console, his hand hovering over the manual release lever. Fallon turned, firing his pistol blindly. The bullets sparked off the metal grating, one grazing Roark's shoulder, but the pain only seemed to fuel the Alpha's momentum. Roark slammed into Fallon with the force of a freight train, driving the Beta backward into a rack of servers. Sparks showered down as metal crunched against metal. The impact knocked the gun from Fallon's hand, sending it skittering over the edge of the catwalk to the concrete floor below. Merritt didn't wait to see who would rise from the wreckage. She ran to the console, her eyes scanning the complex array of switches and dials. The pressure gauges on the nightshade vats were redlining. Fallon had already initiated the pre-purge sequence. The pressure was building to blow the seals. She had to depressurize the system manually without releasing the toxin. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, overriding the automated protocols with codes she had memorized from watching Fallon enter them earlier that day. "Come on!" she hissed, sweat stinging her eyes inside the mask. "Don't lock me out now." Behind her, the fight was brutal and visceral. Fallon had managed to draw a combat knife from his boot, slashing wildly at the massive wolf. Roark was hindered by the narrow space of the catwalk. He couldn't use his full weight without risking a structural collapse that would send them both into the vats below. He snapped his jaws, catching Fallon's forearm, and the sickening crunch of bone echoed even through the roar of the ventilation fans. Fallon screamed, a muffled sound of agony, but he didn't stop. He kicked out, his boot connecting with Roark's injured shoulder, driving the wolf back a step. "I won't let you take it," Fallon shouted, his voice distorted by his mask as he scrambled back toward the lever, abandoning the knife. "If I burn, you all burn." Merritt looked up from the screen. The override failed. Hard lock. The only way to stop the purge was to cut the power to the magnetic seals physically. She looked at the main breaker box on the wall, 10 feet away. It was heavy industrial voltage. "Roark, get back," Merritt yelled, grabbing the wrench she had set down. She didn't run for the console, she ran for the wall. She swung the wrench with both hands, smashing the padlock on the breaker box. It took 2 hits, the metal groaning, before the door swung open to reveal the thick copper bus bars humming with lethal electricity. Fallon saw what she was doing. He lunged for her, ignoring the wolf, his eyes wide with panic. "Don't! You'll kill the containment field." "That's the point," Merritt gritted out. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the steel wrench across the 2 main contact points. Chapter 22. The Wolf and the Warlord. The explosion of sparks was blinding, a miniature supernova of blue-white light that turned the dim catwalk into a strobe-lit nightmare. The wrench welded instantly to the copper bars, completing the circuit and sending a catastrophic surge back through the system. The sudden arc flash threw Merritt backward, slamming her hard against the railing. Her vision went white, and the air inside her mask tasted metallic, like licking a battery. But above the ringing in her ears, she heard the heavy mechanical thunk-thunk-thunk of the magnetic seals, engaging into their fail-safe lockdown positions. The humming of the vats died instantly. The pressure gauges dropped to 0. The nightshade was trapped, inert and useless inside its steel coffins. Fallon stood frozen, staring at the dead console. His life's work, his leverage, his weapon, all neutralized by a piece of hardware store metal. He turned slowly to look at Merritt, his hands shaking. He looked small now. Without his poison, without his guards, without his leverage, he was just a man in a suit standing in a room with a monster. Roark had recovered. He shook his massive head, clearing the daze from the flash, and then he advanced. He didn't rush this time. He stalked. He moved with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier, forcing Fallon back step by step until the Beta's back hit the railing. Roark shifted, the transformation tearing through the air with a wet, cracking sound. He stood in his human form, naked from the waist up, his body bleeding from the bullet graze and the knife wound, but looking utterly unbothered by the damage. He didn't bother with a mask. His alpha physiology was already purging the chloramine from his blood, though his eyes were red and irritated. "Take off the mask," Roark ordered, his voice a ruined growl that sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. Fallon hesitated, looking at the drop behind him, then back at the king. Trembling, he reached up and unbuckled the straps, letting the respirator fall to the grating. He was pale, sweating profusely, the chemical burns from the gas already starting to redden his skin. "I surrender," Fallon gasped, raising his hands. "I claim prisoner status under the Geneva." "You are a domestic terrorist," Roark cut him off, stepping closer. "You manufactured a biological weapon to use against your own species. You kidnapped a queen. You framed an innocent woman. There is no prisoner status for you." "I have the antidote," Fallon blurted out, desperate. "The formula. I never wrote it down. It's in my head. If you kill me, you'll never be able to cure the long-term effects of the nightshade on your own system." Roark stopped. He looked at Merritt, who was pulling herself up from the floor, clutching her ribs. She pulled off her mask, gasping in the cleaner air circulating from the open blast doors. She looked at Fallon with cold, scientific detachment. "He's lying," Merritt said, her voice raspy. "He didn't invent the antidote. He doesn't know the chemistry. He hired a team. The data is on the servers in the command room. I saw the encrypted files while I was waiting for the isotope to trigger. We don't need his brain, Roark. We just need his hard drive." Fallon's face crumpled. The last card in his deck had just been burned. He looked at Merritt with pure venom. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged, not to fight, but to push past Roark and jump for the ladder. It was a cowardly, desperate move. Roark didn't even turn his body. He simply reached out, grabbed Fallon by the throat, and lifted him off his feet. He slammed the Beta against the mesh wall of the cage, the impact rattling the entire structure. "You wanted to break her," Roark snarled, tightening his grip until Fallon's face turned purple. "You wanted to use her mind. You forgot that she is smarter than you. She didn't just beat you, Fallon. She dismantled you." Roark drew back his fist, and for a second, Merritt thought he was going to take Fallon's head off. But he stopped. He looked at Merritt. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she was holding herself up. She didn't need more violence. She needed justice. Roark released the chokehold, dropping Fallon to the metal grate. Before the Beta could draw a breath, Roark delivered a precise, surgical kick to the knee, shattering the joint. Fallon screamed, curling into a ball. "Secure him," Roark shouted to the soldiers below. "And get a medic team up here. The queen is injured." He turned to Merritt, the rage vanishing from his face instantly, replaced by a desperate, aching tenderness. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms. He didn't care about the gas, the blood, or the audience. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of bleach and sweat and life. "You crazy, brilliant woman," Roark whispered against her skin, his body shaking. "You swallowed a radioactive isotope. I should lock you in a tower for that." "You can try," Merritt mumbled against his chest, her legs finally giving out. "But I'll just pick the lock." Chapter 23. The Ledger. The extraction was a blur of efficiency. Roark's team moved like a single organism, securing the prisoners, seizing the hard drives, and cordoning off the chemical vats for the hazmat disposal units. Merritt sat on the tailgate of the armored transport in the loading bay, a thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders, an oxygen mask pressed to her face to help clear the last of the chloramine from her lungs. She watched as Fallon was dragged out on a stretcher, handcuffed and sedated, his empire of poison reduced to a crime scene tape and a federal indictment. Roark stood nearby, shirtless and bandaged, debriefing his generals. He kept glancing at her every few seconds, as if to confirm she hadn't vanished. The bond in her head was quiet now, a warm, steady hum of reassurance. The static was gone. A second transport arrived, tires screeching on the concrete. The doors opened, and 2 figures were escorted out by royal guards. Magnus and Lydia Prescott looked terrified, blinking in the harsh work lights. They looked at the soldiers, the chemical tanks, and finally, at their daughter sitting on the tailgate of a war machine. Merritt lowered the oxygen mask. She expected to feel anger. She expected to feel the old resentment that had fueled her for years. But looking at them now, shrunken, pale, and utterly out of their depth, she just felt tired. Roark walked over, intercepting them before they could reach her. He towered over Magnus, his presence intimidating even without the growl. He held up a tablet. "We decrypted Fallon's personal finance ledgers," Roark said without preamble. "It confirms everything Merritt suspected. The gambling debts were manufactured. Fallon owned the shell companies that held your markers. He inflated the interest rates illegally. He blocked your attempts to refinance with the Royal Bank." Magnus stared at the tablet, his mouth opening and closing. Tears welled in his eyes. He told me I was just unlucky. He said he was helping me by consolidating the loans. "He was farming you," Roark said brutally. "He needed leverage to get to Merritt. You weren't a gambler, Magnus. You were a target." Lydia covered her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. She looked at Merritt, her eyes filled with shame. "We didn't know. Merritt, please. We thought we were saving the family. We thought if you married him, we would all be safe." Merritt stood up, letting the blanket fall. She walked over to her parents. She didn't hug them. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she didn't turn away, either. "You sold me," Merritt said quietly. "You can't undo that. You put a price on my life because you were too afraid to fight him." "I know," Magnus whispered, bowing his head. "I am so sorry." "The debt is gone," Merritt continued, her voice gaining strength. "Roark has seized Fallon's assets, the money he stole from you. It's being returned. The house in Ashen Vale is yours, free and clear. You don't owe anyone anything anymore." Lydia reached out a trembling hand, but Merritt stepped back. "But I'm not coming back," Merritt said. "I have a new home, and I have a lot of work to do. If you want to be part of my life, you need to fix yours first. No more secrets, no more fear. You go to therapy, you rebuild the clinic, you earn your way back." Roark stepped up beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, a solid, unshakable weight. "The Crown will provide resources for your rehabilitation," he told them. "But know this. Merritt is not your daughter anymore in the way she was. She is the Queen of the Ironclad. And she earned that title with her own blood, not yours." Magnus nodded, wiping his eyes. He looked at Roark, then at Merritt, seeing the strength in her stance, the way she fit into this dangerous world as if she had been born for it. "You saved us," he said softly. "Even after everything, you saved us." "I saved myself," Merritt corrected. She looked up at Roark. "We saved each other." Guards escorted her parents back to the transport to be taken to a safe house for debriefing. Merritt watched them go, feeling the final tether to her old life snap. It didn't hurt. It felt like cutting a weight loose. "Are you ready to go home?" Roark asked, looking down at her. Merritt looked at the bunker, then at the man who had torn the world apart to find her. "Yes," she said. "Take me home." Chapter 24. The Strategist Queen. 1 month later, the air in the ironclad capital was crisp and clear, stripped of the smog by the autumn winds. The balcony of the Obsidian Palace offered a view that stretched for miles, from the gleaming skyscrapers of the city center to the distant healing green of the Ashen Vale. Merritt stood at the railing, but she wasn't wearing a silk gown or a crown of jewels. She wore a tailored charcoal suit with a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a severe professional knot. She held a datapad in one hand, reviewing the final construction reports for the new medical research facility being built in the Vale. The door behind her opened, and Roark stepped out. He looked different, too. The tension that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling into the cool air. "You're missing your own party," Roark said, handing her a mug. "The ambassadors are asking where the Queen is." "The Queen is hiding," Merritt admitted, taking the coffee. "Ambassador Kyle keeps trying to ask me about my breeding plans. If he asks again, I'm going to sedate him." Roark laughed, a rich, genuine sound that Merritt loved. "He's old-fashioned. He doesn't understand that things have changed." Things had changed. The trial of Beta Fallon had been swift and public. The evidence from the bunker was irrefutable. He was currently serving a life sentence in the deepest level of the silver cells, stripped of his rank and his name. The Nightshade formula had been destroyed, and Merritt's team had successfully synthesized a permanent antidote for the few soldiers who had been exposed. But the biggest change was in the perception of the monarchy. Merritt hadn't allowed herself to be painted as a victim or a romantic figurehead. She had released the logs of the bunker raid. She had let the kingdom see her in the gas mask, holding the wrench. They didn't call her the breeder queen anymore. They called her the strategist. "Leo called," Roark said, leaning against the railing beside her. "He aced his midterms. He wants to know if he can bring a girl home for the holidays." "Only if I can run a background check on her first," Merritt joked, though they both knew she was only half kidding. Roark turned to her, his expression turning serious. He reached out, his fingers tracing the silver scar of the mating mark on her neck. It had healed beautifully, a permanent testament to the night their lives collided. "You know," Roark said softly, "you never actually signed the annulment papers. Technically, you're still stuck with me." "I know," Merritt said, leaning into his touch. "I shredded them." "Good strategy," Roark murmured, pulling her closer until her body was pressed against his. "It wasn't strategy," Merritt whispered, looking up into his amber eyes. "It was instinct." "You were right, Roark. Biology is hard to argue with, but I didn't stay because of the mark. I stayed because you let me hold the wrench." Roark smiled, bending down to kiss her. It wasn't the desperate kiss of the prison cell or the fierce kiss of the wedding. It was a kiss of promise. A promise of a future where they wouldn't just rule a kingdom, they would build a new one. "Long live the Queen," Roark whispered against her lips. "Long live the team," Merritt corrected. She turned back to the view, her hand resting in his, watching the sun rise over a city that was finally safe, ready to face whatever war came next, as long as they faced it together.